Hi, everybody. So today I'm going to do something a little different. There's not so much new content I need to cover with the book at this point because we've already kind of covered the basic arguments and ideas, and we're going to keep going deeper into the data as we read it. So pay attention to those aspects of the book as we cover them. And so instead today I'm going to talk a little bit about careers and employment opportunities in anthropology. So I hope you are ready for me to be extra sardonic, and if not, oh dear. Now, before I get into that, I want to start off with a caveat, which is that in the liberal arts, most students do not go into a career that is um, directly related to their field of study. Meaning, most people with an anthropology degree don't become anthropologists per se. Most people with economics degrees don't become economicists. Most people with biology degrees don't become biologists. Rather, in the liberal arts, we're focused more on giving you translatable skills that will help you in pretty much any career. So basic kind of critical thinking skills especially. Now, I looked up some statistics and I found some different data I didn't find anything I was super satisfied with, but only 27 to 46% of college graduates work in their field of study. So the 27% figure, that's a bit older. That comes from 2013. Whereas the 46% figure, that comes from a 2022 study, but the sample size was only like 1,000 people, so I wouldn't put a ton of weight in that. But that's the data I was able to find. Either way, we're talking about less than half of people go into that field. Everyone else is using those transferable skills. The other caveat I want to give is that as a professor, I am deeply, deeply upset by the implication that the point of higher education is to produce more exploitable workers, to produce workers for the benefit of the economy. There are many things that I think are important about a liberal arts degree. First of all, I value learning anyway. I think everyone should have a right to learning and study and scholarship. I think that's an important thing that every human should be able to access if they want, to the extent that they want. I also think that there's a lot of things that you learn with liberal arts degrees that just are not about making money. I mean, the older paradigm that we used to use, that I was trained in as a teacher, was that we're providing students with the skills for informed democratic citizenship. The idea that you should be able to make informed decisions about policy, you should have scientific literacy skills, you should be able to think about issues of power and inequality so that you can be a fully engaged democratic citizen. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that perspective, but I will say I increasingly wonder how much longer the United States will continue to exist. I mean, just based on the world around us, and I'm an archaeologist, right? So I'm thinking, in 100 years, will the U.S. be around? In 1,000 years? Well, probably not in 1,000. Nation states don't tend to last that long. States don't tend to last that long. And so, anywho, as the world falls apart around us, I don't know, I just think about these things, and the older I get, the more and more I value the parts of my life that are not about my work and that are not about laboring. Because, yes, that's an important thing, and I'm one of the people in the world who chose a job that I am passionate about and that I care about. I think teaching students is important. But also, we're all complicated human beings, and this is just one small part of who we are and the things that bring us joy. Now, there's an important historical context here, right? As an anthropologist, I really do feel like it is my job to take this chance, not just to teach you what are the possible jobs, but also what are the social and historical conditions that shape the world we live in today and the ways we think about higher education today. Because there's really been a pretty major shift in how universities and colleges are run over the past 20 years or so. And this shift has essentially tried to, the short version is it has attempted to shift universities as an organizational structure into a more corporate model of organization that's really geared towards promoting the bottom line. Now, the thing to understand here is that universities are not capitalist modes of production. This is actually a feudalistic mode of production. It's a guild system, like they used in medieval Europe. So, if you think about this, right, in a capitalist mode of production, right, we're really paying attention to the idea of profit and the bottom line, with the idea that you take that profit from your business and reinvest it so then you can make more and more money. The idea is that business should expand indefinitely through this process of investing, making profit, and investing that profit back into your business. Now, another part of this, right, is shareholders, right? Because a lot of businesses today, it's not really about making things, like making things that are useful. It's actually just turning money into more money in this kind of weird magic process where you have shareholders, right? And so the goal of a corporation increasingly is to make money for shareholders, meaning you need to increase the value of the shares of your business indefinitely. So again, it's this idea of everlasting growth. Now, academia is quite different, right? A guild model is quite different. In a guild model, you have masters of a craft, people who are specialists and have been doing this all their life. And they have apprentices, right? People who learn to do that craft. And then they become, after apprentices, they become journeymen, and then there's several other positions until they become masters themselves. Universities are the same thing. Faculty, professors are the masters, quote unquote, right? That's, instead of calling them the master of the craft or grandmaster, they are professors. We have apprentices, we have journeymen, assistant professors, etc., etc. In fact, this is why, and for graduation, we wear all those silly robes. Because that's a holdover from the medieval ages. So with this shift, right, this shift happening in universities over the last 20 years, this shift to a more business-based model, there are several kinds of major transformations. We see a growth or increase in the number of administrative roles and a decrease in faculty roles, the people who are actually doing the teaching. Those faculty roles also, if we look at the full-time faculty roles, are getting cut, and the tenured faculty roles or tenure track faculty roles are in decline. And those positions are increasingly replaced by contingent faculty, which includes visiting professors and postdocs who are going to be there on a contract of usually 1 to 3 years, and adjunct faculty who are part-time and do not enjoy the benefits of things like healthcare provided by their employers. So we're moving away from having faculty with job security and permanence, and towards this kind of model that's essentially geared towards paying faculty less, reducing the number of faculty with job security, because again, in the bottom line framework, if your understanding of the value of, or what an education system should be doing is focused on that bottom line, this is a way of cutting costs. However, there are unseen costs to those practices. For example, it impacts students' education. If you have faculty members who have job security and are well paid and have benefits, they have more time and energy they can put into their teaching. If you have an adjunct faculty, you're looking at someone who's probably making poverty wages. I mean, I made about $20,000 a year, $23,000 in 1 year when I was adjuncting, and I didn't have health benefits. And that was actually pretty well paid for an adjuncting position, so it's pretty dismal. In a position like the one I have here, this is a visiting professor position, so I do have benefits. I do have a full-time wage. However, without job security, that means I'm also putting a lot of money into the job market, into applying for jobs so that I will make sure that I'm employed for the next academic year. Now, that's all time that I could be putting into my teaching to help y'all, and it's time I could be putting into my scholarship to help progress knowledge. So, and the point here is not me as an individual. The point is I'm using my own life, my own story as an example of these larger social processes playing out in academia. Now, particularly over the past 10 years or so, we've seen the rise of a number of popular discourses, conversations, that have really been thinking about this question, or that have really been framing the issue in terms of what are college graduates going to do with their jobs? How do you train college graduates to make more money for the economy? And this is often associated with an emphasis on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And you see certain political factions who are very skeptical of the humanities and social science and often want to defund or underfund those. Really, we've been seeing forms of this since the 70s, when you have the defunding of, for example, arts programs and music programs in elementary, middle, and high schools. Now, as I mentioned, I think we talked about this with the readings on hip hop, that also leads to new forms of music, because when kids can't learn to play instruments in school, they learn to do other things like DJ, and they find other ways to make music, and then you have hip hop. But anyway, coming back to the question of employment and this larger social historical context, right? There's this increasing questioning of the value of these other degrees, to which I would go back to that point that it's not, first of all, it's not always about the economic value of the education. I think there are many aspects of what makes us human beings that does not boil down to making more money, or being more efficiently exploited. But there's also, and then there's also the aspect of the soft skills, right? Those critical thinking skills that I'm going to unpack a little bit further that are very much translatable skills. Now, I was just flipping around looking up statistics to update my PowerPoint, and I found this graph, which was pretty interesting. This whatever you call this diagram, that kind of just breaks down social science degree stuff. I'm not going to go into it particularly, but I figured y'all might want some data on it, or some numbers. And from here, let's go into those soft skills, and I'm just going to outline a few of them. The first one, in anthropology, we learn to understand complex social problems from multiple perspectives, right? So we've been covering things like humans and the environment, right? There's all kinds of environmental social problems. Religious diversity, race, gender, the international development and economies, tourism, disability, any number of these things, right? These social problems. And part of what anthropology teaches you to do is to grapple with their complexity and to grapple with them from multiple perspectives. Remember, this is what Audre Lorde at the beginning of class called the blank. The idea that we can understand those social problems better if we understand them through multiple different people's perspectives and vantage points, and if we work with people who are marginalized within those systems, that those communities have particularly important vantage points that help us understand the root problems better. Now, this is language here that I would recommend just when you get to a point where you're applying for jobs, just fucking use this phrase. This is a skill you will have if you study anthropology or most other liberal arts, at least social science and humanities fields. Understanding complex social problems from multiple perspectives. Another way we can talk about that is to get at the root causes of these social problems. Understanding what are the underlying conditions that cause that, so then we can address those root problems and not just the symptoms. Anthropology teaches you to work well with diverse communities. You know, this is all about understanding human difference, and that's another line that I would just say you can just copy paste into job letters, cover letters. You're learning to work with diverse communities. That's something that a lot of employers really want because, first of all, their employees are going to be diverse in all kinds of ways. And second of all, they might serve communities that are diverse, right? Or they might have outreach programs or any number of things. So this is something that is increasingly valued by many businesses today. And actually, I feel like I should add on to this because I have a little special insight into this because I work as a independent consultant occasionally, consulting with firms, businesses, nonprofits on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. I work with a larger team. And we're contracted by organizations like the Carter Center in Atlanta or the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. We've been contracted by Habitat for Humanity, Coca-Cola, all kinds of people, right? And the point here, right, is that all of these businesses and nonprofits are investing, they're even bringing in consultants to improve their diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in the workplace. And so the fact that they're doing that tells you that these are valued, that these are increasingly valued skill sets that employers want. Anthropology also teaches you scientific literacy, especially when it comes to policy. As I keep saying, right, it's important to understand the data and how the data contributes, or how the data lends itself to conclusions or not. So that when people advocate for certain policy changes, we can actually look and say, hey, is that policy really going to be an effective response to this problem? Or is there a misunderstanding in the data and methodology, right? So in anthropology, part of what you're learning, and this is again true for most liberal arts programs, you're learning to think critically about scientific processes, and you're developing scientific literacy skills. And that is really important when it comes to making effective policy. Because you can look critically at the studies that motivate those or the studies that justify those policies and evaluate whether those policies effectively make use of the conclusions or not, and effectively make use of the data. So I've given you a number of examples of this, right? Last class we talked about Jason DeLeon and his findings from forensic anthropology and a forensic approach that helps expose some of the problems and erasures embedded within the data that humanitarian efforts use to organize their work. And that's the same data that policymakers are using when they think about these kinds of legal regulations. I gave you examples from, for example, gender-affirming care, right? The ways in which scientific studies are mistranslated and misrepresented to the broader public, including things like comments being made about people who detransition, but using that word detransition in a way that is quite distinct from how scientists doing these studies use it. So, as an example, going to go into that, right? Detransition, um, on the level of the studies, how the studies that measure this define it, detransition just means you go back to living in your gender assigned as birth for some period of time. That doesn't mean you don't. It doesn't mean it's not permanent. You can detransition and then retransition. And most of the reasons why people detransition have nothing to do with their internal gender identity. It has much more to do with things like losing access to health care or health insurance, things like negative pressures or discrimination from their family or workplaces or friends, or any number of things like that. It has to do with things like negative medical reactions to particular forms of gender-affirming care that make that no longer feasible in that person's specific instance. It's any number of those things, right? And if you look at the number of people who detransition and say it's because they actually believe they were cisgender, it's something like 0.003% of the number of people who transition. And even that includes people who say, yeah, I did gender-affirming care for a while. I realized I was cisgender. That wasn't who I am. But it was still a really important part of my life in which I explored my gender identity, and I'm really grateful for that. It was a positive part of my life. So that's just an example of these kinds of mistranslations of studies to impact policy, right? So when we talk about scientific literacy, we're starting to understand how do we understand those kinds of mistranslations and issues, misrepresentations in policy, many of which are completely unintentional. They just happen because people don't have as much scientific literacy as they might, and news media largely doesn't challenge these misrepresentations, which is also a historical shift. News media was quite different, for example, in the 60s. It had a very different role in society than the one it does today. So this is going to be really important, particularly in fields of employment where you might be focused specifically on policy. You learn data collection and research skills. I've used that kind of stuff. I only had a year after graduating from undergrad before going into grad school. But I was working at the University of Miami Office of Civic and Community Engagement, and I was using data collection and research skills constantly. A lot of what I did involved synthesizing data and findings from reports. Whenever the office would start a new program, I would benchmark how other institutions did that and study what they did and what they found and their experiences with that in order to identify best practices. So I'm constantly pouring through and synthesizing various research reports. And I'm also, in certain cases, collecting my own data. Like I designed assessment programs or assessment procedures to evaluate if our programs were having the effect we wanted or not. And all of that are things that many people will use in their careers. And then there's verbal and nonverbal communication. Soft skills for sure, but really important ones. With your writing, right? I keep emphasizing to y'all, hey, make sure you flesh out your supporting evidence. Demonstrate your claims with supporting evidence. Show the data. Go deeper into the data. Make sure you explain your thesis clearly. Those kinds of basic writing skills are essential, right? By being a good writer, first of all, you write better cover letters, you get jobs, and a lot of these jobs, like if they involve written communication, you're learning those kinds of things. Likewise, with verbal communication, you learn how to present complex ideas and talk through complex ideas. One aspect of being human is it involves a lot of communication, at least when you're around other humans. Um, and so in the workplace, those are essential skills, and almost every job is going to list on the requirements that they want employees to have good verbal and nonverbal communication skills. And then there's working in groups to complete complex projects within a deadline. As y'all have learned, group work is stressful. It's fucking hard. It is a complex cluster of skills that you do have to learn. You aren't born with. And this is something that employers are looking for. Because in any employment situation, you're going to work with your coworkers to complete complex projects and meet deadlines. Now, in the next few slides, I'm just going to talk about specific career trajectories that many anthropologists go from. So shifting away from those transferable skills and into the particular occupations that people go into after an anthropology degree. I found this, I couldn't find any data specific to anthropology, but I did find it on the basis of social science degree. Social science is the category that the Department of Labor measures, not anthropology specifically. So this is the data that we have, if not the data we want. A lot of people go into health, teaching, financial management, or other kinds of management. A lot of people go into law, whether to be lawyers eventually or or judges. Education administrators, teachers, and then of course many people go into retail sales workers because it's the United States and the economy's in shambles. But c'est la vie. Now, a lot of that you can do with a BA. Some of it you need a master's or PhD to do. With a bachelor's degree, you rely heavily on those transferable skills. With a master's or PhD, those tend to be degrees you're getting because you are looking for a more targeted career trajectory that requires that MA or PhD. Here's another graph that just breaks apart the categories slightly different. So with a social science degree, people often go into management, business and financial operations, legal, education, and then sales and related occupations. And then, of course, we have other, which is actually the largest category, and y'all all know how much I love it when the other category is the one with the most people in it. Because that just tells you, wow, we sure are asking the wrong questions here. But we don't know exactly how, because all the data we have, all the information we have is just other here. Now, I found this pretty neato information graphic that kind of just outlines different career trajectories, and it does a good job categorizing them, right? So it talks about there are jobs that are very common for students to go into. There are specialized jobs, meaning you are an anthropologist or something like that. Something that is specifically about doing anthropology. Then there are non-traditional jobs and other potential jobs. I'm not sure exactly how they divide those. But right, most of these jobs you're not actually going to be an anthropologist, and that's normal. Rather, you're taking those transferable skills into all of these other areas. Now, when I think of career trajectories, one thing I think about is a lot of people end up going into careers that are about addressing social problems in some way. So nonprofits, international development, policy analysis, government and government work or contractor work. A lot of the work that gets done to make the government function is actually not done by government employees. It's done by contractors. That's a complicated economic system. I'm not going to go deep into it, but governments use social scientists a lot and anthropologists a lot because, again, with policy, right? Like, policy is supposed to be guided by data, and then you have all of these organizations, including contractors, that make that stuff happen. Now, we saw a number of really great examples throughout this class of how anthropologists can play a role in these kinds of programs and these kinds of industries, right? Whether it's Paige West and dispossession of the environment, or Jason DeLeon talking about the policy implications of his research. There are all of these moments where, as anthropologists, because we are prioritizing the lived experiences and perspectives of marginalized peoples, and because we are really good at identifying the assumptions and the limitations and the exclusions of any given body of data or theory, we are very good at helping nonprofits and international development agencies and governments accomplish the work they want to do more effectively. This is a little bit out of order, but there's this kind of funny thing I was thinking about today or the other day about like how there's a lot in common between anthropology and quantum physics in the sense that like we're both looking at things that are very small. We're looking at a very small scale. And when you look at that small scale, there's something about that small scale that makes it so that what you see just kind of challenges the foundational assumptions and beliefs of every other field of study and just kind of renders the whole rest of it like problematic in some ways. Questionable. I don't mean, yeah, questionable. Objectivity. The concept of objectivity really doesn't work in either of these either. Whether it's quantum physics or anthropology, that small scale, it actually matters a lot. The ways that the process of doing research itself influences the findings. I mean, arguably that's true for larger scale studies as well, but there's something that makes it particularly important for small scale studies, or small scale approaches. And all of this makes anthropology a little hard to assimilate, right? Because like half the time what I'm going to say is like, no, it's more complicated than that, or no, I think you're using arbitrary cultural assumptions and treating them like they're normal, and that's influencing your findings. There's this joke from this show that many of you have probably seen about how nobody likes moral ethics professors or moral philosophy professors. Sometimes I feel that way about anthropologists. Like, we're just really good at breaking up assumptions, and everyone is just like, how do I assimilate that? And I'm like, I don't know. Anywho, right? But actually, there are really good, useful uses for that because we can break up those assumptions. We can contribute in really effective ways to all of these forms of careers, right? Because again, we're focused on we're focused on understanding complex social problems from multiple perspectives. Now, some people with an anthropology degree go into go into the realm of heritage, as a kind of broad field. So this includes museum workers, archivists, park services hire a lot of anthropologists, because parks involve people, and many parks involve relationships, with indigenous communities and poor communities who used to live in those places and things like that. And many parks are very committed to maintaining those relationships. Cultural resource management is a field that archaeologists often go into. It's contract work, essentially cultural resource management, or CRM for short, is a situation where if you are a development company, like you're trying to build something and you're using any form of federal funding, or if you're on federal land, you now are legally obligated to do archaeological and environmental impact surveys to identify if this construction is going to have a negative impact on natural or cultural heritage. So these companies then contract a CRM firm, which is basically a team of archaeologists to test that area and identify if there's anything of historical significance there. And if there is, to figure out the best way to either mitigate the destruction of that evidence or to excavate it and collect that evidence, et cetera, et cetera. When we read that article about the New York burial ground, that was an example of cultural resource management. That was a project that was completed because that area was going to be built on. Government work, a lot of governments, state governments and federal governments do hire anthropologists and archaeologists, especially. Whether it's through the parks or through forestry and wildlife. Also hire archaeologists. Most state governments hire archaeologists. Like there's usually a state archaeological program. That's SHPO, the State Historical Preservation Office. Most tribal governments hire archaeologists as well for the same reason. That's the TIPOs, the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices. My wife used to work for the Seminole Tribes TIPO for a year or so, and she was essentially doing excavations on behalf of the tribe. Whenever the tribe was going to build something, they wanted to make sure that they understood if there was anything important for their heritage in that place and to preserve that heritage before they constructed something new that would destroy that. And then tourism work, right? And so many of these careers are things that I would consider, like, at that point you're becoming an anthropologist or you're becoming a museum professional. So it's not necessarily the majority of what people do, but they are opportunities. These are things that people do with an anthropology degree, and that having an anthropology degree will actually specialize you in and be a really good jumping off point for these kinds of jobs, particularly. But then, as I keep saying, right, most of undergraduate education is about transferable skills, not necessarily about going and becoming a quote-unquote anthropologist. And so that opens up all of these other careers, which is actually where most students end up, is going into any number of other fields. So I talked a little bit about DEI work. A lot of people go into education, either to become administrators or teachers. For example, you might work with student health at a college, or you could teach middle school or something like that. Publishing, for example, magazines, book publishers, things like that. Journalism. Forensics, that is a subfield of anthropology, so that is something that's quite specific. You could be a forensic scientist. A lot of anthropologists end up going into law schools and studying law to become either a lawyer or a judge or magistrate or something like that. Marketing hires a lot of anthropologists. We're really good at understanding and researching different communities' perspectives, and that is valuable to marketing. Universal design researchers, again, because we're quite good at figuring out users' perspectives. That is what we specialize in. HR, that's, again, like that idea of like working well with diverse communities. That's going to be a big deal in places like HR. And really anything. Because those transferable skills I pulled out, you can apply to any job whatsoever. Now, some of these do require getting an MA or PhD. So like a BA is like, that's a very general education kind of framework, whereas an MA or PhD is quite different from undergraduate education in that at this point you're specializing and you're getting pretty narrow. You're focusing on a particular field of study and really a particular area within that particular field of study. So that can involve teaching. You might go and get an MA in education, or you could get a PhD and become an anthropology professor. Um, Social work, you can get a social work degree to do that, as you're a master's in social work. If you go into CRM and you want to take on a management role, it does help to have a master's in anthropology and archaeology specifically. Likewise, some governmental jobs, usually you can, the way the government operates is you can basically get in either with experience or education, and those two things are can be interchangeable within the job search process. So if you have 2 years of experience or you have a master's degree, you could be either of those situations, you can be eligible for many of those jobs. Think tanks, right? Organizations that basically are hiring researchers. I mean, you can definitely do think tank work with a BA, but if you want to be a researcher at a think tank, you might need an MA or PhD. Law, you could get a law degree, as a form of continuing education to go into those fields, like, being a lawyer or what's the word I'm looking for, judge. And so in most of those situations, with the exception of the one of, or maybe two of PhD and CRM, and I guess some of the government jobs, right? What you're actually doing is you're taking those transferable skills and then applying a more specialized form of education from your MA. For example, an MA in education or an MA in social work or law. So then those anthropology skills inform and strengthen your approach to those things. So that kind of sets you up in those fields. Now, I will say for any of those things, imagine who think about or want to be a professor, I mean, it's very rewarding. I love it in many ways. I mean, academic freedom fucking rocks, and I have a lot of autonomy and latitude in what I do. I don't have to, I don't know, in a lot of jobs, you kind of just have to do what your boss tells you, and even if that is not a very useful way of accomplishing the goals that you want to accomplish or that need to be accomplished. And as a professor with a PhD, I don't have to do that. I am treated as an expert in my field, which I am. But what the downside of that is, first of all, grad school is kind of miserable. I mean, my mental health was probably the lowest it's been since I was 18, 17 when I was in grad school. It's just super stressful, extremely high work demands, very hard to maintain any level of personal life outside of grad school. It's extremely stressful. I was quite happier. I was a lot happier after I graduated, and that's common, right? Um, and then you're faced with the academic job market, which is atrocious. I mean, when I apply for jobs, I'm usually applying for, I'll usually be applying for a job alongside usually 100 to up to 900 other candidates, depending on the job. 100 is pretty rare, 900 is pretty rare. I would say 300 seems to be a little average. So, it's a brutal industry. It's exploitative. It's hard to have job security. Um, it's something that you are deeply passionate about. If grad school is something you're deeply passionate about, I will, of course, support you and encourage you in that process. However, if you're not sure, don't do it. Make sure, like, if it's what you want to do and you have a reason to do it, do it. But otherwise, you don't need to subject yourself to that. Make sure you have a reason. I just thought this was funny. Yeah, like, okay, you take an intro class. Sign up for the major reminder today. And if you want to know more information about that, feel free to ask me or come into the department and talk to our office manager, Crystal. Is awesome. And any number of faculty will help you with this process. Um, if you like learning about social problems and understanding systems of violence, sign up for anthropology today. You want to spend the next 4 years thinking about all kinds of violence. But we do all kinds of other things too. I'm just being facetious and silly. And, of course, like archaeology and sociolinguistics, if you're interested in human histories. If you're interested in language, if you're interested in human genetics and or primatology and things like that. Um, these are all things that we have folks to teach you about. But ultimately, I'm not going to take it personally. I think that all majors are good majors. I like anthropology. I chose anthropology in part because I had so many different interests as an undergrad and I was splitting between different majors. And I went to a particular anthropology program that basically was like, hey, if it's humans, it's anthropology, and we can totally integrate all of these other fields. I went to a very interdisciplinary undergraduate college. And I think you'll find that here at College of Charleston, too, just based on the faculty. I don't know them as professors, but I know them as colleagues. And so it let me do a whole bunch of different things. It let me do, like, I could study things that I was interested in from literature and from history and political science and all these other fields. And kind of just integrate them together. And that was pretty cool. In summary, fuck capitalism. Okay, again, you don't need to agree with my values. Don't organize your life based on my values. Organize it based on your values. But I think we put too much weight on careers and jobs. Undergraduate education is the one chance you will ever have in your life to just study things because you fucking want to. Because you think they're interesting. Because you care about them. Because they just tickle your brain in a good way. There is no other time in your life where there will be an entire institutional system to support you doing that. Even in grad school, you'll get that to some extent, but you're also going to have to specialize in a way that is very different. So, enjoy your time in college, learn things, right? Focus on, like, I don't know, this is my idealistic self, right? Like, focus on learning things. Focus on what you think is worth learning about. And worry about begging for corporations to exploit your labor later, after that. And when you get there, you can use all those phrases I gave you to tell them why you are the best person that they should exploit and that they should want to exploit you. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you putting up with my belligerence as I entertain myself as I get through this presentation. That is both important because we do ultimately have to make money in capitalism to eat food, which I like doing multiple times a day. But also, maybe there's just more important. I don't know, that I feel undermines what is truly valuable about a liberal arts education or about any kind of education. Because I really do believe that learning is a good thing. Learning is its own goal. And that every human being should have the right to as much education as they want. But that's just me. And we certainly don't live in that world. So take it where you go. Take with it what you will. And yeah, I hope this is at least informative. Perhaps even humorous. I'll talk to y'all later this week. And we'll keep going through Jason Dilly.